President Bola Tinubu has announced plans to review the regulatory framework governing Nigeria's telecommunications sector to align with global best practices. Now, this initiative aims to enhance infrastructure protection, improve operational efficiency, and create a more investment-friendly environment. With telecommunications playing a pivotal role in our daily lives, from business operations to personal communications, these reforms could have significant implications for customers and consumers and service providers alike.
And so to help us break down this, we're joined by Uti Ellu. She is a customer experience expert, and she joins us live now to just give us a bit of insight into this move by the president. Uti, as always, it's sublime having you join us and seeing your bright face this morning. Good morning to you.
That was my line.
Hi,
that was my line, but it's okay, Judith.
Let's get started, shall we? President Tinubu has emphasized the need to overhaul the telecom sector's regulatory framework to reflect global best practices, right? So from a customer experience perspective, how do you think this review could impact the quality of services provided to Nigerian consumers? Because I got a list, but I'll let you start.
I think, first, it's a good move. Any move that focuses on improving the experience for the consumers absolutely is a win in my book. So every time I hear that customer experience is getting, front and center, it's very exciting for me. So what do we expect, or what do I expect to see as a result of this? I mean, first and foremost is always having, I'm glad that they're starting from a framework, right? So you need to have the right plan in place. So it's one thing, I mean, if you talk about it sometimes from a Nigerian perspective, we're very good at building frameworks. We're very good at policies. Implementation then becomes the actual problem. But first and foremost, it is great to have a framework. It's great to have something that builds on the existing consumer protection policies that we have. We have several acts that govern consumer protection in Nigeria, and the rights and responsibilities of the consumers are clearly defined. So what we expect to see from this kind of framework is defining for that particular sector, so in this case the telecom sector, defining more in detail what the rights of the consumer are, what the responsibilities of the consumers are, what the responsibilities of the MNOs are, because they're the key players in the sector. They're the key service providers, right? So what do we expect to see from them? Given that he's now put some additional approvals in place, I believe there's an executive order that then protects things like fiber optics and the infrastructure, basically, which really is what supports the service that's delivered in the industry. So that's a good foundation. Then coming into the framework to say, clearly defining and building on. Today we have, I think, about 12 rights of the consumer according to the NCC, but really then drilling down into that. And one of those things is the right to be informed. Nigerians, knowledge is power. So understanding what your rights are, understanding that you have a right to redress, understanding that you have a right to complain, and not just complain, not the one where we just sort of sit around with our friends and complain and say this person is not delivering great service, or we just accept it, but realizing most importantly that as a consumer, you have rights, your rights are protected, and you have a voice, and you have one key right, which is to seek redress when you're not happy.
So, Uti, the president also in a meeting with, I think, Airtel's chairman, Sunil Bhatti Mittal, he expressed the pro-business stance and a commitment to creating better infrastructure for consumers and also customers as well. So how might this increase, or investors actually, not consumers this time, how can creating a good platform for investors translate to great consumer or customer satisfaction?
Well, to be honest, if you look at the set of MNOs that we have in Nigeria, only one of them is an indigenous company, right? So this is an investor-heavy, and will I say foreign investor-heavy sector, right? And for those investors, for the sector as a whole, it's a sector that is largely based on imports. All the infrastructure, majority of what that sector uses, right, is imported. So they are largely very, very heavily dependent on FX. They're dependent on having locally an environment that allows them to be able to do business easily, conveniently, and profitably. Let's remember that these are not NGOs; these are actual businesses. And I like that you brought up Mittal because this is a man and an organization that not only provides telecom services in Nigeria. They provide telecom services, I think, in about 14 countries in Africa, Nigeria included, and also in India, which is their home country. And I think they've also now bought into British Telecom. So they are very experienced when it comes to providing this telecom service. So even when we talk about global best practices, one could argue that this particular brand, Airtel, is one of the drivers of best practice across the world, being that they provide this service in so many different locations. So they're no strangers to best practice. But when it comes to them as investors within the Nigerian space, the Nigerian government has a responsibility, and I believe that's what the minister is trying to do and the president is trying to do now, is to create an environment that really allows these businesses to continue to invest in our country, in the infrastructure in our country, because if they don't do that, the customer experience will suffer, right? Mm-hmm. We're all used to dialing a number and we hear, oh, the number you're calling is not allocated. You hear, oh, this line is not currently available. There's a whole myriad of messages that Nigerians have become used to when trying to use these services.
Hang on a second,
all
Uti.
Down to poor infrastructure.
Uti, can I redirect this questioning now? Can I look at the investor as the customer now? Because we can see that where it affects them, it affects the consumers themselves, which is you and I. We're paying higher for tariffs now because, well, of course, it's more expensive to actually bring us these services.
You also clamored for it.
So what do you think the president could actually do to make it home for these foreign investors here in Africa, here in Nigeria, considering our inflation, considering our hike in the price for petrol or diesel, which these telecom industries actually use to power these stations, where we have these masts and all of that? How can Nigeria make it home for these investors?
So I think that the first place to start there is definitely with the infrastructure. For any business, any retail business, which is what the telcos are, Nigeria is a dream location, right? The amount of people that we have, the spread that we have across the country. So Nigeria would be a pretty important location for any serious MNO. But the reality of it is, the government has to put the infrastructure in place. So that's why I said that this executive order is fantastic, because the fact is these companies and the service that they provide, they suffer from a lot of vandalization, degradation of their infrastructure, of the towers, of cable cuts, fiber optic cable cuts. These are the things that affect the service that we as the end consumers receive. So having this protection in place now means that you're going to get a better level of service. The MNOs are going to be able to get restitution when they have these fiber cuts. That essentially means that they're not just carrying the cost single-handedly of getting you back online and getting you back the service that you're paying for. So that is a very, very critical step. The other thing that could be done, now we've just had a tariff hike about a month ago. Now, that tariff hike took years. I believe it was probably somewhere in the region of 10 years of lobbying to get the tariff hike. Again, these are businesses. The environment has to be conducive. The numbers have to be conducive. These businesses and these organizations are putting in hundreds of millions of dollars into our environment for these services, and they deserve a return for their income or for their investment. So the reality of it is,
right, Uti,
yes,
sorry to cut you there, but when we think about, because when you're talking about, the contributions that they're making, the fact that this is a profit-making, venture, and they do have to make money, there's also gaps in the services that they provide, There's data depletion, which we've talked about, and the media has raised concerns about people who buy 100 gig never lasting. You have to renew your data 3 or 4 times on your mobile phone, not more. What more your internet connection at home? There's that. There's also the fact that the services, whether it's call or data, is either slow or it's
non-existent.
It's horrible.
No, it's still coming back. It's still coming back to the point that I was trying to make.
Well, there are challenges then that pretty much still exist in the telco sector. So what then should be urgent for the regulatory regulatory organizations to pretty much intervene on, instead of this price hike that we have seen?
So this is the perspective that I was trying to put it to the fore, right? So there's first and foremost the fact that you have to realize that it's like they say it takes money to make money, right? Now, if it's taking you 10 years to get a price review, in that time you've been spending money. In that time there's been currency devaluation. In that time there's been rapid growth in inflation. Now, in 10 years, you will agree that even in your personal income and expenses, you will agree that both sides have increased, right? So in not having allowed the income to increase, right, you have to be able to calibrate these things. It can't take 10 years for a price hike because guess what? When the price hike happens, right, which is what we're feeling now as Nigerians, it's coming at the worst possible time and it's coming at a higher rate. So what we've done is, I mean, the telcos wanted 100%. We ended up at 50%. 50% is a huge increase for any consumer to have to bear. Ideally, what it should be is that I get 2%, and then maybe I get 5%, it's single digit increases or even less than a single digit increase. And so over time, the consumer has time to adjust. The organization also has an increase in income, which again then leads to an ability to continue to invest more, which then leads to better infrastructure and stable service. So if you kind of see, it's like a chicken and egg situation, which comes first, or a vicious cycle. It all feeds into each other. The difference is we spent this whole period of time sort of limiting their ability to earn money. And when you look at it from the perspective where they say, oh, our revenue has dropped, it's going to take us some time for our revenue to get back to where it was pre-currency devaluation. I'm on the side of the consumer, right? I think that the consumer is priority. Every business needs consumers to survive, and the consumers have to be able to pay for the service and get the service that they've paid for. But the reality is that if the service provider is hamstrung, then it's going to impact the consumer at the end of the day. So do you see why I call it a vicious cycle?
I do see what you're saying. But it would seem that this is coming on the timeline very misplaced, because if they had had this conversation from before the tariff increase, maybe present them with conducive policies for them to make better business, that would not have translated to us, the customers, seeing the price hike. Just a thought.
Right.
I'm wondering.
As we're even talking about,
if you did have a price hike, it certainly wouldn't be 50%. If you even just did a 5% every year, if I just did a simple division, right, and said there was a 5% increase every year over the last 10 years, it would certainly be easier to stomach, and it would be certainly easier on the consumer's pocket than a 50% increase in one go.
And mind you, the highest earning CEO of all of the the public sector and private sector, or the business terrain, is pretty much one of the CEOs of one of the telco companies, not naming names, just saying. But again, then it begs to ask the question whether the regulatory commissions who are in charge of the telcos to ensure that the consumers are, the needs are met and they meet standard, have dropped the ball in ensuring that consumers are satisfied.
Well, the responsibility on the regulator now is to make sure that we get value for the 50% increase.
Right.
Mm-hmm. So you now have a 50% increase. It's not what you wanted, but this is where the regulator can't go to sleep now, right? So, to whom much is given, much is expected. Now, we may not, by their definition, they may not think they've been given much, but they've been given something. So now we require something in return. For me, the signal that that infrastructure is a critical asset, that classification by the government, signals to me an understanding of the criticality of the sector to our economy. As the service sector is the biggest contributor. So at the end of the day, right, or one of the biggest contributors. So at the end of the day, it makes sense, and it signals that the government is thinking in the right direction. What I hope to see is that thought crystallizes into action. It crystallizes into penalties and protections around fiber optic cables. I mean, we all remember what happened last year when the undersea cable was cut.
Yes.
It gives you, if you remember that incident, it gives you a clear picture, a visual picture of the criticality of this infrastructure to us as a nation. If you think about the other key sectors that depend on the telcos, banking sector heavily depends on the telcos. So the reality of it is critical. So the government needs to make sure that this executive order that's been signed is not just we're going to sign it and put it aside. It's time for the minister to ensure that this infrastructure is being protected. The required activities in terms of ensuring that, will I say, the right agencies, the right bodies, the NCC, are making sure that that infrastructure is protected, that the ability for the telcos and the MNOs to put in more investments, to lay more cables. You know, when you're going to lay cables, it's not just the NCC. You probably have the Ministry of Works. You know, there's a whole ecosystem and value chain that goes to delivering this service. How do we make it easier for all of these organizations to do business, to be functional, to be effective? That's where the government comes in. So now it's time to execute. If all of that is done, then you've basically taken away every bit of wiggle room for these companies to say, we have challenges. We need to get value for our 50% increase.
Uti, want to say thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
When one gets you started on anything customer experience, it's hard to get you to stop. But thank you, Uti, for gracing us with your intellectual responses this morning on the matter. Thank you.
I mean, my brain can't get past the cable incident from, was it last year, 2 years ago? Couldn't get past. Every time I see a wire, I think, oh, this thing is underwater. Impressive. Uti, once again, thank you.